Introduction. The medieval emissaries of the Catholic Church brought to Great Britain, in addition to the whole corpus of sacred history, a continental university system based on the Greek and Latin classics. Such native legends as those of King Arthur, Guy of Warwick, Robin Hood, the Blue Hag of Leicester, and King Lear were considered suitable enough for the masses, yet by early Tudor times, the clergy and the educated classes were referring far more frequently to the myths in Ovid, Virgil, and the grammar school summaries of the Trojan War. Though official English literature of the 16th to the 19th centuries cannot, therefore, be properly understood, except in the light of Greek mythology, the classics have lately lost so much ground in schools and universities that an educated person is now no longer expected to know, for instance, who Deucalion, Pelops, Daedalus, Aeone, Laocoon, or Antigone may have been. Current knowledge of these myths is mostly derived from such fairy story versions as Kingsley's Heroes and Hawthorne's Tanglewood Tales, and at first sight this does not seem to matter much, because for the last 2,000 years it has been the fashion to dismiss the myths as bizarre and chimerical fancies, a charming legacy from the childhood of the Greek intelligence, which the Church naturally depreciates in order to emphasize the greater spiritual importance of the Bible. Yet, it is difficult to overestimate their value in the study of early European history, religion, and sociology. Chimerical is an adjectival form of the noun chimera, meaning she-goat. 4,000 years ago, the chimera can have seemed no more bizarre than any religious, heraldic, or commercial emblem does today. She was a formal composite beast with, as Homer records, a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. A chimera has been found carved on the walls of a Hittite temple at Carchemish, and, like other such composite beasts as the Sphinx and the unicorn, will originally have been a calendar symbol. Each component represented a season of the Queen of Heaven's sacred year, as, according to Diodorus Siculus, the 3 strings of her tortoiseshell lyre also did. This ancient 3-season year is discussed by Nilsson in his primitive time reckoning. Only a small part, however, of the huge, disorganized corpus of Greek mythology, which contains importations from Crete, Egypt, Palestine, Phrygia, Babylonia, and elsewhere, can properly be classified with the chimera as true myth. True myth may be defined as the reduction to narrative shorthand of ritual mime performed on public festivals, and in many cases recorded pictorially on temple walls, vases, seals, bowls, mirrors, chests, shields, tapestries, and the like. The chimera and her fellow calendar beasts must have figured prominently in these dramatic performances, which, with their iconographic and oral records, became the prime authority or charter for the religious institutions of each tribe, clan, or city. Their subjects were archaic magic-makings that promoted the fertility or stability of a sacred queendom or kingdom, queendoms having, it seems, preceded kingdoms throughout the Greek-speaking area, and amendments to these introduced as circumstances required. Lucian's essay, On the Dance, lists an imposing number of ritual mimes still performed in the 2nd century AD, and Pausanias's description of the temple paintings at Delphi and the carvings on Cypselus's chest suggest that an immense amount of miscellaneous mythological records, of which no trace now remains, survived into the same period. True myth must be distinguished from 1. Philosophical allegory, as in Hesiod's Cosmogony. 2. Etiological explanation of myths no longer understood, as in Admetus's yoking of a lion and a boar to his chariot. 3. Satire or parody, as in Silenius's account of Atlantis. 4. Sentimental fable, as in the story of Narcissus and Echo. 5. Embroidered history, as in Arian's adventure with the dolphin. 6. Minstrel romance, as in the story of Cephalus and Prochorus. 7. Political propaganda, as in Theseus's federalization of Attica. 8. Moral legend, as in the story of Eriphylle's necklace. 9. Humorous anecdote, as in the bedroom farce of Heracles, Omphale, and Pan. 10. Theatrical melodrama, as in the story of Thestor and his daughters. 11. Heroic saga, as in the main argument of the Iliad. 12. Realistic fiction, as in Odysseus's visit to the Phaeacians. Yet genuine mythic elements may be found embedded in the least promising stories, and the fullest or most illuminating version of a given myth is seldom supplied by any one author. Nor, when searching for its original form, should one assume that the more ancient the written source, the more authoritative it must be. Often, for instance, the playful Alexandrian Callimachus, or the frivolous Augustan Ovid, or the dry-as-dust late Byzantine Tzetzes, gives an obviously earlier version of a myth than do Hesiod or the Greek tragedians, and the 13th century Exidium Troiae is in parts mythically sounder than the Iliad. When making prose sense of a mythological or pseudo-mythological narrative, one should always pay careful attention to the names, tribal origin, and fates of the characters concerned, and then restore it to the form of dramatic ritual, whereupon its incidental elements will sometimes suggest an analogy with another myth, which has been given a wholly different anecdotal twist, and shed light on both. A study of Greek mythology should begin with a consideration of what political and religious systems existed in Europe before the arrival of Aryan invaders from the distant north and east. The whole of Neolithic Europe, to judge from surviving artifacts and myths, had a remarkably homogeneous system of religious ideas, based on worship of the many-titled Mother Goddess, who was also known in Syria and Libya. Ancient Europe had no gods. The great goddess was regarded as immortal, changeless, and omnipotent, and the concept of fatherhood had not been introduced into religious thought. She took lovers, but for pleasure, not to provide her children with a father. Men feared, adored, and obeyed the matriarch, the hearth which she tended in a cave or hut being their earliest social centre, and motherhood their prime mystery. Thus the first victim of a Greek public sacrifice was always offered to Hestia of the hearth. The goddess's white, aniconic image, perhaps her most widespread emblem, which appears at Delphi as the omphalos, or navel boss, may originally have represented the raised white mound of tightly packed ash, enclosing live charcoal, which is the easiest means of preserving fire without smoke. Later, it became pictorially identified with the lime-whitened mound under which the harvest corn doll was hidden, to be removed sprouting in the spring, and with the mound of seashells or quartz or white marble underneath which dead kings were buried. Not only the moon, but, to judge from Hemera of Greece and Grania of Ireland, the sun were the goddess's celestial symbols. In earlier Greek myth, however, the sun yields precedence to the moon, which inspires the greater superstitious fear, does not grow dimmer as the year wanes, and is credited with the power to grant or deny water to the fields. The moon's 3 phases of new, full, and old recalled the matriarch's 3 phases of maiden, nymph, nubile woman, and crone. Then, since the sun's annual course similarly recalled the rise and decline of her physical powers, spring a maiden, summer a nymph, winter a crone, the goddess became identified with seasonal changes in animal and plant life, and thus with Mother Earth, who, at the beginning of the vegetative year, produces only leaves and buds, then flowers and fruits, and at last ceases to bear. She could later be conceived as yet another triad, the maiden of the upper air, the nymph of the earth or the sea, the crone of the underworld, typified respectively by Selene, Aphrodite, and Hecate. These mystical analogues fostered the sacredness of the number 3, and the moon goddess became enlarged to 9 when each of the 3 persons, maiden, nymph, and crone, appeared in triad to demonstrate her divinity. Her devotees never quite forgot that there were not 3 goddesses but 1 goddess, though by classical times Arcadian Stymphalus was one of the few remaining shrines where they all bore the same name, Hera. Once the relevance of coition to childbearing had been officially admitted, an account of this turning point in religion appears in the Hittite myth of simple-minded Apu. Man's religious status gradually improved, and winds or rivers were no longer given credit for impregnating women. The tribal nymph, it seems, chose an annual lover from her entourage of young men, a king to be sacrificed when the year ended, making him a symbol of fertility rather than the object of her erotic pleasure. His sprinkled blood served to fructify trees, crops, and flocks, and his flesh was torn and eaten raw by the queen's fellow nymphs, priestesses wearing the masks of bitches, mares, or sows. Next, in amendment to this practice, the king died as soon as the power of the sun, with which he was identified, began to decline in the summer, and another young man, his twin, or supposed twin, a convenient ancient Irish term is tanist, then became the queen's lover, to be duly sacrificed at midwinter, and, as a reward, reincarnated in an oracular serpent. These consorts acquired executive power only when permitted to deputize for the queen by wearing her magical robes. Thus kingship developed, and though the sun became a symbol of male fertility once the king's life had been identified with its seasonal course, it still remained under the moon's tutelage, as the king remained under the queen's tutelage, in theory at least, long after the matriarchal phase had been outgrown. Thus the witches of Thessaly, a conservative region, would threaten the sun in the moon's name with being engulfed by perpetual night. There is, however, no evidence that, even when women were sovereign in religious matters, men were denied fields in which they might act without female supervision, though it may well be that they adopted many of the weaker sex characteristics hitherto thought functionally peculiar to man. They could be trusted to hunt, fish, gather certain foods, mind flocks and herds, and help defend the tribal territory against intruders, so long as they did not transgress matriarchal law. Leaders of totem clans were chosen, and certain powers awarded them, especially in times of migration or war. Rules for determining who should act as male commander-in-chief varied, it appears, in different matriarchies. Usually the queen's maternal uncle, or her brother, or the son of her maternal aunt was chosen. The most primitive tribal commander-in-chief also had authority to act as judge in personal disputes between men, insofar as the queen's religious authority was not thereby impaired. The most primitive matrilineal society surviving today is that of the Nayars of southern India, where the princesses, though married to child husbands whom they immediately divorce, bear children to lovers of no particular rank, and the princesses of several matrilineal tribes of West Africa marry foreigners or commoners. The royal women of pre-Hellenic Greece also thought nothing of taking lovers from among their serfs, if the 100 houses of Locris and Epizephirian Locri were not exceptional. Time was first reckoned by lunations, and every important ceremony took place at a certain phase of the moon, the solstices and equinoxes not being exactly determined but approximated to the nearest new or full moon. The number 7 acquired peculiar sanctity, because the king died at the 7th full moon after the shortest day. Even when, after careful astronomical observation, the solar year proved to have 364 days, with a few hours left over, it had to be divided into months, that is, moon cycles, rather than into fractions of the solar cycle. These months later became what the English-speaking world still calls common law months, each of 28 days, which was a sacred number in the sense that the moon could be worshipped as a woman, whose menstrual cycle is normally 28 days, and that this is also the true period of the moon's revolutions in terms of the sun. The 7-day week was a unit of the common law month, the character of each day being deduced, it seems, from the quality attributed to the corresponding month of the sacred king's life. This system led to a still closer identification of woman with moon, and since the 364-day year is exactly divisible by 28, the annual sequence of popular festivals could be geared to these common law months. As a religious tradition, the 13-month years survived among European peasants for more than a millennium after the adoption of the Julian calendar. Thus Robin Hood, who lived at the time of Edward II, could exclaim in a ballad celebrating the May Day festival, "How many merry months in the year? There are 13, I say," which a Tudor editor has altered to, "There are but 12, I say." 13, the number of the sun's death month, has never lost its evil reputation among the superstitious. The days of the week lay under the charge of Titans, the genii of sun, moon, and 5 hitherto discovered planets, who were responsible for them to the goddess as creatrix. This system had probably been evolved in matriarchal Sumeria. Thus the sun passed through 13 monthly stages, beginning at the winter solstice, when the days lengthen again after their long autumnal decline. The extra day of the sidereal year, gained from the solar year by the Earth's revolution around the sun's orbit, was intercalated between the 13th and the 1st month, and became the most important day of the 365, the occasion on which the tribal nymph chose the sacred king, usually the winner of a race, a wrestling match, or an archery contest. But this primitive calendar underwent modifications. In some regions, the extra day seems to have been intercalated, not at the winter solstice, but at some other new year, at the Candlemas cross-quarter day, when the first signs of spring are apparent, or at the spring equinox, when the sun is regarded as coming to maturity, or at midsummer, or at the rising of the Dog Star when the Nile floods, or at the autumnal equinox, when the first rains fall. Early Greek mythology is concerned, above all else, with the changing relations between the queen and her lovers, which begin with their yearly or twice-yearly sacrifices, and end at the time when the Iliad was composed and kings boasted, "We are far better than our fathers," with her eclipse by an unlimited male monarchy. Numerous African analogues illustrate the progressive stages of this change. A large part of Greek myth is politico-religious history. Bellerophon masters winged Pegasus and kills the Chimera. Perseus, in a variant of the same legend, flies through the air and beheads Pegasus's mother, the Gorgon Medusa, much as Marduk, a Babylonian hero, kills the she-monster Tiamat, goddess of the sea. Perseus's name should properly be spelled Tertius, the destroyer, and he was not, as Professor Kareni has suggested, an archetypal death figure, but probably represented the patriarchal Hellenes who invaded Greece and Asia Minor early in the 2nd millennium BC and challenged the power of the triple goddess. Pegasus has been sacred to her because the horse with its moon-shaped hooves figured in the rain-making ceremonies and the installment of sacred kings. His wings were symbolical of a celestial nature rather than speed. Jane Harrison has pointed out that Medusa was once the goddess herself, hiding behind a prophylactic Gorgon mask, a hideous face intended to warn the profane against trespassing on her mysteries. Perseus beheads Medusa. That is, the Hellenes overran the goddess's chief shrines, stripped her priestesses of their Gorgon masks, and took possession of the sacred horses. An early representation of the goddess with a Gorgon's head and a mare's body has been found on Boeotia. Bellerophon, Perseus's double, kills the Lycian chimera. That is, the Hellenes annulled the ancient Medusan calendar and replaced it with another. Again, Apollo's destruction of the Python at Delphi seems to record the Achaeans' capture of the Cretan earth goddess's shrine. So does his attempted rape of Daphne, whom Hera thereupon metamorphosed into a laurel. This myth has been quoted by Freudian psychologists as symbolizing a girl's instinctive horror of the sexual act. Yet Daphne was anything but a frightened virgin. Her name is a contraction of Daphne, the bloody one, the goddess in orgiastic mood, whose priestesses, the Maenads, chewed laurel leaves as an intoxicant and periodically rushed out at the full moon, assaulted unwary travellers, and tore children or young animals in pieces. Laurel contained cyanide of potassium. These Maenad colleges were suppressed by the Hellenes, and only the laurel grove testified to Daphne's former occupancy of the shrines. The chewing of laurel by anyone except the prophetic Pythian priestess, whom Apollo retained in his service at Delphi, was tabooed in Greece until Roman times. The Hellenic invasions of the early 2nd millennium BC, usually called the Aeolian and Ionian, seem to have been less destructive than the Achaean and Dorian ones which they preceded. Small armed bands of herdsmen, worshipping the Aryan trinity of gods, Indra, Mitra, and Varuna, crossed the natural barrier of Mount Othrys and attached themselves peacefully enough to the pre-Hellenic settlements in Thessaly and central Greece. They were accepted as children of the local goddess, and provided her with sacred kings. Thus a male military aristocracy became reconciled to a female theocracy, not only in Greece, but in Crete, where the Hellenes also gained a foothold and exported Cretan civilization to Athens and the Peloponnese. Greek was eventually spoken throughout the Aegean, and by the time of Herodotus, one oracle alone spoke a pre-Hellenic language. The king acted as the representative of Zeus, or Poseidon, or Apollo, and called himself by one or other of their names, though even Zeus was for centuries a mere demigod, not an immortal Olympian deity. All early myths about the gods' seduction of nymphs refer apparently to marriages between Hellenic chieftains and local moon priestesses, bitterly opposed by Hera, which means by conservative religious feeling. When the shortness of the king's reign proved irksome, it was agreed to prolong the 13-month year to a great year of 100 lunations, in the last of which occurs a near coincidence of solar and lunar time. But since the fields and crops still needed to be fructified, the king agreed to suffer an annual mock death and yield his sovereignty for one day, the intercalated one, lying outside the sacred sidereal year, to the surrogate boy-king, or interrex, who died at its close and whose blood was used for the sprinkling ceremony. Now the sacred king either reigned for the entire period of a great year, with a Tanist as his lieutenant, or the two reigned for alternate years, or the queen let them divide the queendom into halves and reign concurrently. The king deputized for the queen at many sacred functions, dressed in her robes, wore false breasts, borrowed her lunar axe as a symbol of power, and even took over from her the magical art of rain-making. His ritual death varied greatly in circumstance. He might be torn in pieces by wild women, transfixed with a stingray spear, felled with an axe, pricked in the heel with a poisoned arrow, flung over a cliff, burned to death on a pyre, drowned in a pool, or killed in a prearranged chariot crash. But die he must. A new stage was reached when animals came to be substituted for boys at the sacrificial altar, and the king refused death after his lengthened reign ended. Dividing the realm into 3 parts, and awarding 1 part to each of his successors, he would reign for another term, his excuse being that a closer approximation of solar and lunar time had now been found, namely 19 years, or 325 lunations. The great year had become a greater year. Throughout these successive stages, reflected in numerous myths, the sacred king continued to hold his position only by right of marriage to the tribal nymph, who was chosen either as a result of a foot race between her companions of the royal house, or by ultimogeniture, that is to say, by being the youngest nubile daughter of the junior branch. The throne remained matrilineal, as it theoretically did even in Egypt, and the sacred king and his Tarnist were therefore always chosen from outside the royal female house, until some daring king at last decided to commit incest with the heiress, who ranked as his daughter, and thus gain a new title to the throne when his reign needed renewal. Achaean invasions of the 13th century BC seriously weakened the matrilineal tradition. It seems that the king now contrived to reign for the term of his natural life, and when the Dorians arrived, towards the close of the second millennium, patrilineal succession became the rule. A prince no longer left his father's house and married a foreign princess. She came to him, as Odysseus persuaded Penelope to do. Genealogy became patrilineal, though a Samian incident mentioned in the pseudo-Herodotus's Life of Homer shows that for some time after the Apatoria, or festival of male kinship, had replaced that of female kinship, the rites still consisted of sacrifices to the mother goddess, which men were not eligible to attend. The familiar Olympian system was then agreed upon as a compromise between Hellenic and pre-Hellenic views. A divine family of 6 gods and 6 goddesses, headed by the co-sovereigns Zeus and Hera, and forming a council of gods in Babylonian style. But after a rebellion of the pre-Hellenic population, described in the Iliad as a conspiracy against Zeus, Hera became subservient to him. Athene vowed herself all for the father, and in the end, Dionysus assured male preponderance in the council by displacing Hestia. Yet the goddesses, though left in a minority, were never altogether ousted, as they were at Jerusalem, because the revered poets Homer and Hesiod had given the deities their titles and distinguished their several provinces and special powers, which could not be easily expropriated. Moreover, though the system of gathering all the women of royal blood together under the king's control, and thus discouraging outsiders from attempts on a matrilineal throne, was adopted at Rome when the Vestal College was founded, and in Palestine when King David formed his royal harem, it never reached Greece. Patrilineal descent, succession, and inheritance discourage further myth-making. Historical legend then begins and fades into the light of common history. The lives of such characters as Heracles, Daedalus, Tiresias, and Phineus span several generations, because these are titles rather than names of particular heroes. Yet myths, though difficult to reconcile with chronology, are always practical. They insist on some point of tradition, however distorted the meaning may have become in the telling. Take, for instance, the confused story of Aeacus's dream, where ants, falling from an oracular oak, turn into men and colonize the island of Aegina after Hera has depopulated it. Here the main points of interest are that the oak had grown from a Dodonian acorn, that the ants were Thessalian ants, and that Aeacus was a grandson of the river Asopus. These elements combine to give a concise account of immigrations into Aegina towards the end of the second millennium BC. Despite a sameness of pattern in Greek myths, all detailed interpretations of particular legends are open to question until archaeologists can provide a more exact tabulation of tribal movements in Greece and their dates. Yet the historical and anthropological approach is the only reasonable one. The theory that Chimera, Sphinx, Gorgons, Centaurs, Satyrs, and the like are blind uprushes of the Jungian collective unconscious, to which no precise meaning had ever, or could ever have been attached, is demonstrably unsound. The Bronze and early Iron Ages in Greece were not the childhood of mankind, as Dr. Young suggests. That Zeus swallowed Metis, for instance, and subsequently gave birth to Athene through an orifice in his head, is not an irrepressible fancy, but an ingenious theological dogma which embodies at least three conflicting views. 1. Athene was the parthenogenous daughter of Metis, i.e. the youngest person of the triad headed by Metis, goddess of wisdom. 2. Zeus swallowed Metis, i.e. the Achaeans suppressed her cult and arrogated all wisdom to Zeus as their patriarchal god. 3. Athene was the daughter of Zeus, i.e. the Zeus-worshipping Achaeans spared Athene's temples on condition that her votaries accepted his paramount sovereignty. Zeus's swallowing of Metis, with its sequel, will have been represented graphically on the walls of a temple, and as the erotic Dionysus, once a parthenogenous son of Semele, was reborn from his thigh, so the intellectual Athene was reborn from his head. If some myths are baffling at first sight, this is often because the mythographer has accidentally or deliberately misinterpreted a sacred picture or dramatic rite. I have called such a process iconotropy, and examples of it can be found in every body of sacred literature which sets the seal upon a radical reform of ancient beliefs. Greek myth teems with iconotropic instances. Hephaestus's three-legged workshop tables, for example, which ran by themselves to assemblies of the gods, and back again, are not, as Dr. Charles Seltman archly suggests in his 12 Olympian Gods, anticipations of automobiles, but golden sun discs with 3 legs apiece, like the emblem of the Isle of Man, apparently representing the number of 3-season years for which a son of Hephaestus was permitted to reign on the island of Lemnos. Again, the so-called Judgment of Paris, where a hero is called upon to decide between the rival charms of 3 goddesses and awards his apple to the fairest, records an ancient ritual situation, outgrown by the time of Homer and Hesiod. These 3 goddesses are one goddess in triad: Athene the maiden, Aphrodite the nymph, and Hera the crone, and Aphrodite is presenting Paris with the apple rather than receiving it from him. This apple, symbolizing her love bought at the price of his life, will be Paris's passport to the Elysian fields, and the apple orchards of the West to which only the souls of heroes are admitted. A similar gift is frequently made in Irish and Welsh myth, as well as by the 3 Hesperides to Heracles, and by Eve, the mother of all living, to Adam. Thus Nemesis, goddess of the sacred grove who, in late myth, became a symbol of divine vengeance on proud kings, carries an apple-hung branch, her gift to heroes. All Neolithic and Bronze Age paradises were orchard islands. Paradise itself means orchard. A true science of myth should begin with a study of archaeology, history, and comparative religion, not in the psychotherapist's consulting room. Though the Jungians hold that myths are original revelations of the pre-conscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings, Greek mythology was no more mysterious in content than are modern election cartoons, and for the most part formulated in territories which maintained close political relations with Minoan Crete, a country sophisticated enough to have written archives, 4-story buildings with hygienic plumbing, doors with modern-looking locks, registered trademarks, chess, a central system of weights and measures, and a calendar based on patient astronomic observation. My method has been to assemble in harmonious narrative all the scattered elements of each myth, supported by little-known variants which may help to determine the meaning, and to answer all questions that arise, as best I can, in anthropological or historical terms. That is, I am well aware, much too ambitious a task for any single mythologist to undertake, however long or hard he works. Errors must creep in. Let me emphasize that any statement here made about Mediterranean religion or ritual before the appearance of written records is conjectural. Nevertheless, I have been heartened, since this book first appeared in 1955, by the close analogues which E. Meyerowitz's Aachen cosmological drama offers to the religious and social changes here presumed. The Aachen people result from an ancient southward emigration of the Libyo-Berbers, cousins to the pre-Hellenic population of Greece from the Sahara Desert oases, and their intermarriage at Timbuktu with Niger River Negroes. In the 11th century AD, they moved still farther south to what is now Ghana. 4 different cult types persist among them. In the most primitive, the moon is worshipped as the supreme triple goddess Ngame, clearly identical with the Libyan Neith, the Carthaginian Tanit, the Canaanite Anatha, and the early Greek Athene. Ngame is said to have brought forth the heavenly bodies by her own efforts, and then to have vitalized men and animals by shooting magical arrows from her new moon bow into their inert bodies. She also, it is said, takes life in her killer aspect, as did her counterpart, the moon goddess Artemis. A princess of royal line is judged capable, in unsettled times, of being overcome by Ngame's lunar magic and bearing a tribal deity which takes up its residence in a shrine and leads a group of emigrants to some new region. This woman becomes Queen Mother, war leader, judge and priestess of the settlement she founds. The deity has meanwhile revealed itself as a totem animal, which is protected by a close taboo, apart from a yearly chase and sacrifice of a single specimen. This throws light on the yearly owl hunt made by the Pelasgians at Athens. States, consisting of tribal federations, are then formed, the most powerful tribal deity becoming the state god. The second cult type marks Aachen coalescence with Sudanese worshippers of a father god, Odo Mankoma, who claim to have made the universe single-handedly. They were, it seems, led by elected male chieftains, and had adopted the Sumerian 7-day week. As a compromise myth, Ngame is now said to have vitalized Odo Mankoma's lifeless creation, and each tribal deity becomes one of the 7 planetary powers. These planetary powers, as I have presumed also happened in Greece when Titan worship came in from the east, form male and female pairs. The Queen Mother of the state, as Ngame's representative, performs an annual sacred marriage with Odo Mankoma's representative, namely her chosen lover, whom, at the close of the year, the priests murder, skin, and flay. The same practice seems to have obtained among the Greeks. In the third cult type, the Queen Mother's lover becomes a king, and is venerated as the male aspect of the moon, corresponding with the Phoenician god Baal Haman, and a boy dies vicariously for him every year as a mock king. The Queen Mother now delegates the chief executive powers to a vizier, and concentrates on her ritual fertilizing functions. In the fourth cult type, the king, having gained the homage of several petty kings, abrogates his moon god aspect and proclaims himself Sun King in Egyptian style. Though continuing to celebrate the annual sacred marriage, he frees himself from dependence on the moon. At this stage, patrilocal supersedes matrilocal marriage, and the tribes are supplied with heroic male ancestors to worship, as happened in Greece, though sun worship there never displaced thunder god worship. Among the Arkan, every change in court ritual is marked by an addition to the accepted myth of events in heaven. Thus, if the king has appointed a royal porter and given his office lustre by marrying him to a princess, a divine porter in heaven is announced to have done the same. It is likely that Heracles' marriage to the goddess Hebe and his appointment as porter to Zeus reflected a similar event at the Mycenaean court, and that the divine feastings on Olympus reflected similar celebrations at Olympia under the joint presidency of the Zeus-like High King of Mycenae and Hera's chief priestess from Argos. I am deeply grateful to Janet Seymour Smith and Kenneth Gay for helping me to get this book into shape, to Peter and Lalage Green for proofreading the first few chapters, to Frank Seymour Smith for sending scarce Latin and Greek texts from London, and to the many friends who have helped me to amend the first edition. Robert Graves, Daya, Mallorca, Spain.